madam. It's a pleasure meeting you.
Nice
all
to
over
see you again,
after so many
Katie,
years.
after a long time.
So thank you for making time to be with us today.
Pleasure.
And I suppose you're aware that we will be getting into a conversation about your professional life, sometimes interestingly touching on the fringes of your personal life as well. Yeah, is that okay?
Quite okay.
All right. So could you tell me how you first got interested in India specifically, and then in the temple architecture in India?
Certainly. I mean, it's the hardest question, and it's bound to come first. But let me try. It was. I didn't go to India till I was in my late 20s. But India was never a foreign concept to me. My parents, who are architects, long since retired, are Indophiles. They like Indian art, so that had an influence. And I was growing up in Britain that was already multicultural, so there were plenty of Indian people around. So it wasn't something foreign, but I have to confess it was exotic in those days. So when I studied architecture at Cambridge, there were no courses on Indian architecture, of course, but I started reading books.
Not even in your history classes?
Not even.
No
I think there was Ron Lucock once came and gave one lecture, but that's not, that wasn't the road to Damascus or anything. But there was not a single lecture in the mainstream course in those days. But I looked at books, and it was a sort of post-hippie age as well. All that stuff was around. I could have become a Hare Krishna or something, but no, nothing like that. I didn't get converted to anything at all. But there was some element of spiritual quest in there. I was reading Jung, Jung's psychology, reading about mandalas.
Yes, Jung spent time in Benares. He visited Benares.
I visited Benares, but not but the American Institute of Indian Studies, which was their photos of temples, not for anything spiritual. But there was this, I was interested in mandalas and all that kind of stuff, and I even had some Jungian dreams about going to these centralized buildings and trying to find the way to the center. So that kind of thing probably drew me to Indian temples. And yes, they were exotic.
That's one thing we share. I'm also a Jungian.
Oh, right, there we are. So that was a starting point. And of course, if you're getting into it through Stella Kramrisch and Kumaraswamy and all those kind of people, in those days we could believe, I'm talking about the 70s, we could believe there was a sort of spirit, that there was this thing called India, and that you could somehow reach that thing. Of course, now postmodern age, we can't really say that. Kind of whole.
When you say spirit, what do you mean by spirit?
Well, I was putting it in heavy inverted commas to say that we have to be cautious of such things, but I don't think that we should throw away the possibility of grasping some kind of whole. Now, the whole of Indian culture that's a big ask, so I'm not claiming any such.
It's a big hole.
It's a big hole, but when it comes to my particular window into such a thing, which is architecture, I've always thought that it's important to look at the big picture through history, across a wide area, and to look for what, while not trying to say that it's all the same, there are principles which jump out at you, which not everybody talks about, and those things are worth talking about. And there's always, it's like a huge jigsaw puzzle, and there are always parts to discover, even in familiar buildings, as well as things that are still coming to light, where you're filling in, you're sketching out and then filling in the details of this amazing whole, which of course relates, it's an architectural whole, a whole looking at a building as a whole, looking at traditions as a whole and how they interrelate. But these things then relate to other branches of culture, religion, philosophy, and all the rest. So
religion and philosophy particularly.
Yes.
So I also saw that in the papers that you've written on the typologies of Nagara and the Dravida styles, your departure point was a reference to Stella Kramarish, where she talked about the relationship between the Western Maharashtrian architecture to that of the Patihara style, or style that you studied through.
Nagara Dravida.
That's a distinction that you have made.
Yeah, I've made, and I.
But her parallel was between the two geographical positions, drawing parallels.
Yes, I think she and a lot of other people recognised. I mean, Ferguson already, made this division into what he called Indo-Aryan and Dravidian, using those racial terms. So those broad divisions have been recognised for a long time, and I see them as architectural languages, with a kit of parts and ways of putting those parts together. But I'm moving away from emphasising too much, only those two. I think they are the widespread media or languages through which temples have been created for a long
Between
time.
6th and 13th century.
Between 6th and 13th century, and then they go on with various revivals and survivals, and there's a lot of continuity after that. But it's also interesting to look at what goes on in between, using those languages, mixing them.
Was your PhD work focused on that?
It was focused on that. My PhD work was on the temples in Karnataka from 6th to 13th centuries, and trying to show how we need to see that as a whole tradition, not as early Chalukya, Rashtrakuta, late Chalukya, Hoysala, these dynastic things. There's this continuous transformation which happens through the tradition, and it happens in other traditions as well, that they never start from nothing, but the architects draw out, having created a system, they draw out the possibilities that are inherent in it and create new forms out of the existing forms. And typology is important here because although it sounds like typology always sounds like a kind of dry discipline that people impose on phenomena, but in Indian temple architecture it's there from the start. They start with these wooden thatched temple types, very simple temple forms made out of wood. These become monumentalized, made into stone or brick, and then new types are created by combining existing types. The earlier types become the edicules, the images of temples, the building components out of which new forms are created. And that's one of those common principles which you find using different forms, but using that idea that the temple is a house for the god made out of lots of little houses of God, just as you have one God with many manifestations or aspects, or subordinate gods, if you want to see it like that. So the temple is made out of a lot of smaller temples. And once you recognize what those components are, then you see the composition,
the correlation,
and that's all combination of types to make new ones, and it's an endlessly inventive game. It's not the fact that there's this pattern very often, a particular pattern of evolution, where one form emanates out of another, and another out of that, and another out of that, and so on, doesn't mean it's kind of predestination. It's very creative, but there are certain inherent formal things in the structure, in the system, and they go through the whole range, and they explore
I have one
everything.
Additional question regarding this, how typology is being looked at in at least in the writings that I've read from yours. I find that there is a less emphasis on spatial typologies, and there is more emphasis in your work on the physical
external form, the materiality.
of the form.
Yes, there is. And
if I may just complete my question, whereas in most traditions, the philosophy or the underlying whole in say Shaivism or Vaishnavism or whatever ism, Jainism or Buddhism or whatever ism you want to call, the underlying whole has an expression also in the speciality of the temple. But that seems to be less discussed in your work. Is that deliberate?
I don't think. I would argue that that's not me. That's the subject. And my argument is both from looking and more recently from the texts, in that, and it's true that later temples, develop amazing spatial complexes and organizations, but this idea of the type, the temple being the image of a type, the picture of this building that has a god inside, I think that's essential from the start, and this combination of types to make these really complicated, beautiful, sensuous forms. To me, that's what it's about, and it is spatial. The inside the shrine, you've got the Garbhagriha, which is with the god in it. That's the center, but that's not some extraordinary architectural space. But that's not to say that the space, it is spatial in that it's interpenetrating volumes emanating from this center. So you have space and you have time, but it's not like a Gothic cathedral enclosed interior.
It's
interior
not a
space.
congregational form of worship anyway.
And when you look at the texts, maybe we'll come on to the texts later.
Maybe paraphrase it differently. To say, if you look at, for instance, early Jain temple shrines, not temples, shrines, they are actually, I would argue, an interpretation of the concept of shunyata as an extraction of material rather than as a construction of material. Yeah? That's when I say directly how conceptual frame translates into a spatiality. And it's the idea of shunyata is pervasive in almost everything, like in every ism it is pervasive. But perhaps was more central to the Jain thinking, and thereby as a corollary also in Buddhist thinking. I'm calling it thinking, but it's something much larger than that. The essence of the religion, which then is translated into form. Okay, so in the case of Shiva temples, you have, for instance, this idea of gamanam, in which there is the movement of the plan form in a clockwise direction. by adding elements at the corners which actually create a sense of movement in the form. But these are all expressed primarily in plan form rather than in material form.
Early Jain temples, are you talking about cave temples?
Yes, caves.
Yes. Yeah, caves.
All others are later celebration of Tirthankaras and not really of the central concept. Yeah.
Which are like Hindu temples but with different iconography. But then you have early Brahmanical temples which are also caves as well as Buddhist. Yes. But it's, and of course there's this amazing interiority in those spaces, but I don't think the exterior manifestation of an inner principle is denying the possibility that it might be a void from which these forms emerge. I think those patterns are there and embody a perception about the universe and creation and nature and growth. And then the philosophical interpretation that you put on it is open to thinking, it all comes from nothing, God is immanent in the material, or God is beyond, and this definitely God is there. That's the idea is, it's from one which you can think of as formless and without form, and nishkala, and it's coming, but nishkala, shakala into form. The formal patterns are so rich and suggestive, as well as highly structured, that they allow you to think about all these philosophical ideas.
They do. My question was that you seem to be more concerned, your research is both textual and through drawing. You are inquiring into the phenomena of the temple through text.
Yes.
And I think you're one of the few people who've done it. I'm not just saying it like that, but if you look at the essence of how original practitioners of the Padmashalis who did the buildings, theirs was a very direct combination of text and drawing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
that's the method they used to actually bring the building into being.
Totally.
And it's interesting to see that you are using the same route to interpret the building.
I came from it entirely from the drawing end as an architect. When I started out, for many years, my research methodology, to use that high-flown phrase, was looking and drawing mainly, and internalizing the architectural languages through looking, drawing, and understanding how it all works. And then I thought, well, I don't think these texts are very relevant, because when you see references in books to the text, they're often nonsense. They're often generalizing. The texts say, they don't say which text, they don't tell you where it says, and they either take the approach that these were written by Brahmins, they're totally theoretical, they're nothing to do with architecture, which I tended to believe, or they tell you everything, they're very sacred, you have to follow them, all that stuff, but you have to follow them verbatim. But they never, these people who say that, they never show you how it's done and how you follow them. So for many years I didn't think, I had, like as a lot of us have done, I suppose, get a translation of Maya Matam or Mansara, and you think you're going to find the meaning of life, and you start reading it and you think, oh my God, what's all this? You can't make head or tail of it. But finally, about 10, 15 years ago, I had a project with one Sanskritist working on it and translating Samrangana Sutradhara, and I worked with him, Mattia Salvini, on the text, and I suddenly realized that if you've got those architectural systems in your head, and once you twig what kind of temple are they talking about, and Samrangana is a text that has North Indian, South Indian, and different traditions in it, Bhumija, Varata.
12 different chapters dealing
with different sorts of temples, a lot of them North Indian, but also other ones.
To chapter 64 in your text quite extensively.
I looked at several of those. The 64 is that? Oh, that's Varata temples. That's a new, yes, yeah. That's one which I missed out of the book that I wrote called Theory and Practice of Temple Architecture in Medieval India, where I looked at the Nagara, Dravida, Bhumija temples in that book. I'd missed out Varata, and then later I've figured out, I think I know what it's talking about. It's talking about the tradition that you find in Chhattisgarh, Dakshina Kosala, that type of temple which is neither Dravida nor Nagara, has its roots in the milieu out of which both emerged, and thereby has a lot in common with both, but is different. So that's that Varata. So to come back to the relationship between texts and drawings and buildings, having that opportunity to work with a Sanskritist, I realised that, of course, it's not just a matter of translating the words, because if you don't understand the architecture, it doesn't make any sense at all. But if you look at the words and you realize what kind of temple they're talking about, you can slowly follow it through, and they'll give you the plan, and then they'll give you the elevation. You can actually draw the design from the text. It's not a matter of knowing the words, because the words of the vocabulary is very fluid. It varies from text to text.
And very cross-referential in many ways. So unless you know the cross-references.
Well, it's really contextual. So you know, the same word can mean a lot of different things in different locations, because they're not that bothered about the words. They're you know, it's like saying the thingamajig is on top of the what's his name, and the doodah is next to that. And if you know what they're talking about, you know what they mean by the thingamajig, you know, and it's this big and it's that big. So you can work it out, but that doesn't mean it's prescriptive and that it's like a formula and you just read the text and you turn it into a building, because you have to know the tradition and you have to interpret. There are bits it leaves out which you have to fill in. You also have to improvise, because it only gives you the bones,
it gives you a
skeleton.
Conceptual frame.
A conceptual
which can
frame.
Expand horizontally, spatially.
Yeah, and you have to fill in the details, and you have to decide certain things. So it's actually giving you the starting point, which forces you to be creative and do something that you wouldn't have done otherwise. And sometimes more than others. Sometimes it's more standard, and sometimes the text itself, the person or people who wrote the text are being very creative and going through the permutations and the possibilities and inventing amazing new designs in the temples.
That's how the evolutionary growth of this architecture takes place.
Yes,
by pushing
it. And some of those ones were never built, just as some were built which were probably never written about in texts. And an interesting thing about the evolutionary growth is that pattern I was talking about of emanating forms, you know, from one into many, one form comes out of another, splits, that, you can see it, you can observe it if you look across the centuries through these traditions. But it's also very often,
especially that 6th and 13th century,
especially
gap
then,
where
especially then,
actually
yeah.
you can see visibly the growth of a conceptual
yes,
frame.
yes, really organically.
I only understood that after I read it. Thank you.
And once you get to the later temples, the funny thing is, the beautiful thing is that that growth is expressed as movement within the individual temple. So in Karnataka, for example, you know, you have this, and then it goes this, and then this, like that. So if you look at, or with the Nagara tradition, you have that, and then, and then, and then, you know, and so on. So you look at one of those temples, and you have the whole tradition is there. All the earlier ones are still there in the later one, and one is coming out of another, and it's there as a dynamic pattern. But when you look at the texts, they aren't doing architectural history. It's not, you know, they're not going back and, you know, saying this is 9th century, this is 10th century. You know, they're written at a particular time. A lot of them 11th century onwards. So they are of their time, but they have that same way of thinking of one in terms of sequences which get more and more complicated, where one thing is drawn out of another. So you don't find exactly the same as you find happened in history, but you find that same way of thinking where they'll tell you, here is the first temple, it's called such and such, it's like this, and then they'll say, add this and do this and do this and this, and it'll get more complicated, and you know, and so it goes on in this emanation. And they'll also say sometimes, take this one and then put such and such a type in the middle or on top. And that's wonderful, because it's just the kind of principle you actually see people doing. One thing, and it becomes the top of another, and another one comes out. So the way of thinking is the same. It's not that these are theoretical things divorced from practice. It's the same minds are writing these texts as designing the temples.
So that unity between text and form, which is so specific to architecture. I mean, I'm saying specific to architecture because I know only architecture. I don't know how music, for instance, text and form actually correlates in music. Or in dance, for that matter, is very close to architecture. Like, for instance, you almost got up and performed now, describing the form of the building. That's actually directly emanating from the form. Text emanating from the form.
And form. I mean, I think these patterns, which you can compare to dance, they're not. I think they are in the forms. I think
they are in the form.
And of course it can be difficult to convince someone unless they see it or they feel it. You can do drawings with little arrows on, or you can jump around, but there
is an actuality and a core.
There is.
From where there is no deviation.
And I had the opportunity a few years ago to do an animation with the British Museum that I'd always thought, if you can do, a drawing can show so much, but if you could do an animated drawing, you can actually show, you know, that this pattern can be conceived and shown. And if someone wants to say, no, it's a different pattern, yeah, okay, then you do one animation, you show the different pattern. There may be other ways, but these aren't just abstract concepts. They are actually spatial and temporal patterns that you can show.
So after you have arrived at this two what you can call dominant typologies of the Dravida and Nagara form. You have also talked about how it's varied between Dakshina Kosala and Uttara Kosala. Yeah? Could you tell us the distinction between these two forms?
That Dakshina Kosala thing, which I think is what the texts, or at least what the Samarangana Sutradhara means by the term
Raja
Varata.
Who wrote the Samarangana Sutradhara is from 6th century?
No, he's from 11th century, from Malwa.
There have been a number of Bhoj.
There have been various Bhoj, but the most famous Bhoj, I think, is this Raja Bhoj from Dhar, yeah, that one. And he had this big cultural project, and many books are ascribed to him, and including this Samarangana Sutradhara. It doesn't mean he sat down and wrote it.
Yeah,
he didn't.
In his court.
It was certainly in his court. It fits with all the other.
Because the level of scholarship that's required to write a text like that is possibly a king never had access to.
No, he didn't. But neither is it even, in my view, it's not even one person. They collect. There were these traditions, different traditions going on, and it was a time when they're becoming aware of these different traditions. It's the equivalent of what you have in Karnataka at that time in the 11th century, where you have these miniature temples in the temple wall, which are showing Nagara, Dravida, Bhumija, and all these different forms. They're proud of knowing these different. They have their own tradition. They're proud of knowing the different ones. And Samarangana is the textual equivalent of that. Even the Nagara chapters in there, they're not all the same. You get the same temple names in a different chapter, different design. They have different ways of thinking. And the Bhumija chapter, that's really interesting. That's another kind of in-between Nagara, Dravida, and very consciously. And the unique thing about Bhumija temples, those are those ones with the Kuta stampas going like that, and you like that. Often they can be orthogonal, or they can be star-shaped. They're consciously including some Nagara elements and Dravida, and that chapter in the text is really the most coherent and the most rigorous, has this kind of mathematical rigor, because I think they're developing the theory and the practice alongside. They're inventing. It's unusual. Most temple forms evolve gradually, but here they're inventing a new form, not out of nothing, but combining existing things and inventing the theory at the same time. And you have the drawings, that same Raja Bhoj, his temple, the Bhojeshvara, as it may be called, Shiva temple at Bhojpur, unfinished, that comes from the same context as the Samarangana Sutradhara. So as part of that same study, I studied the drawings on the rocks, and they're well known, but they had never been redrawn. So I measured them. They're quite big, a little bit worn out, so you have to fill in the bits that are missing. So I could redraw the drawings, and then you can compare it with the text. Some people had said it's an application of the text. Nothing's ever just an application, But it's the same way of thinking. You have drawings which are a conceptual framework, giving the proportions, just like in a text. But you also have, seems obvious when you know it, you also have working drawings which were the templates for the temple. And these are full size, full-size columns, ceiling, mouldings. And from the drawings, you can actually reconstruct the original design of the temple. When it's what you see now is this sort of stubby square thing, and I realized when I figured it all out from the drawings that was just the garbhagriha. There was an ambulatory path around, walls around it, and it was going to be intended to be this huge Bhumija temple. About how, if you think of Brihadeshwara temple in Tanjore, biggest medieval Indian temple, you put it next to it, and this was about half as high again. I mean, no, he never finished it, of course. It was probably megalomaniac and far too ambitious, so it was never done, but it would have been this huge thing.
But it's possible that it was not his megalomania, but the
should we say ambition?
The scales that were used by the Sthapatis, which actually would have interpreted itself into, or grown, multiplied into.
Well, shall we say it was ambitious and optimistic and grandiose.
Finally connected with the size of the linga.
It was indeed, and also the size of the dam and the lake. There was this huge lake next to it, which it was all interconnected. Irrigation, feeding the people, feeding the army. Creating this kind of huge center of power.
Actually, when you talk about the lake, I traveled to your newest kind of adventure into inquiry into temples, which you have done in Telangana, because there is reference to Devuni Gutta with a large lake and the most astounding structure.
Where's the reference?
There is lots of things about you on the internet.
No, I didn't mean. Please give me.
And there are images of you climbing.
That's
perhaps,
true.
Kind of 6-7 meters up.
Something like
on the temple. That was in last January.
That was January
I
this
envy
year. Yes.
Your youthful adventure spirit.
I love climbing up temples.
On a temple which already looked like it's crumbling.
Well, climbing up temples is it's something that I started to, with full permission. Well, that temple's in a jungle, no need for permission. But I've been lucky enough in the last sort of 10 years or so to have ASI permission to climb up temples to measure. So measurement was. I never started with measurement. It was, and I still think measurement is not the primary thing. It's the form, the imagery, which is the starting point. But of course, measurement has to come
measurement is
into it.
so critical for the construction of the building.
For the construction and for
everything is so correlated
and communicating.
to measurement.
Totally. So I started measuring and comparing measurements, and then later looking at the texts and comparing. And you can see often
in this particular context. My question was about the presence of this large lake and the temple together. That's often a conjunction that one sees.
Oh, absolutely.
If not
it's
a naturally formed lake, a designed kund.
A man-made one.
So that correlation between water or a structure which is kind of into the earth to a structure that's built up, constructed up into the sky, that correlation is very
often there, and the rulers were making tanks and temples as part of their duties, and the tanks were irrigating and providing fish, and the temples were ensuring prosperity and harmony and good harvest and all the rest. It wasn't that one was practical, one was spiritual. They were both seen as,
It's one and the same.
one and the same.
And there were many newspaper reports which came out at the time in around January 19, where you're quoted as saying that this temple is also 6th century. What is the basis on which you said it's 6th century?
I think it's around 6th century. It's a unique temple that was discovered a couple of years ago in a jungle, small jungle, but a jungle nonetheless, known to local people, but not to the outside world. And that's what's amazing how in India is how these kind of things still get found all the time. And it's a kind of missing link, really, between the wooden multi-story structures that you see at places like Amravati, depicted with thatched roofs, wooden pillars and so on, and a thatched dome, circular or octagonal, those kinds of multi-storied structures which were there, and Dravida temple architecture, which comes out of that, but which has already formalized it into a language of masonry. So, it's not a... maybe Percy Brown and people will say these are copies of wooden, but they're not copies, they're transformations. They're already formalized. And this one seems to me to be a vision of a heavenly palace full of very worn out but beautiful. And it seems to be between these wooden buildings and the formalized masonry language, where it's almost more like a big sculpture. It's like piling up the stones and making a sculpture of this heavenly building, but the pillars and the roofs haven't got that formal rhythm which they later have.
And it's certainly one of the most intriguing buildings I've seen, and I hope that will also become one of your study.
I've written a small article with
you will find an altogether new typology, perhaps.
It's Corinna Vessels-Mavison has written about the iconography, and I contributed a little bit on the building. It's a new typology. I think it's another illustration of how Nagara and Dravida come out of this common heritage, where the type
the Shilparatna is the common element.
I'm talking about the architectural formal heritage of the wooden buildings with
the artisanal heritage.
Well, it comes through that, but in terms of architectural language, it's the roof shapes, wooden buildings with dome forms, barrel vaulted roofs, piled up eaves, horseshoe arch gables on the end of the barrel vault. All those things provide the starting point for both those architectural languages. I'm talking that kind of common heritage.
I would like to also ask you, what is your current engagement? And finally, what brings you to India now?
Right, current engagement is, I'm still working on this Hoysala temple, new Hoysala temple in Karnataka, which has been going on for some years, but I've done the drawings for that, and hopefully when it's built it'll be there, hand carved, and not a copy, but a sort of extrapolation from that tradition.
Designing the temple?
Yes. I did the overall design a few years ago.
I'm sure that's like it's a point of arrival.
Yes, well, I hope
where you can actually translate your research into a real thing.
It certainly is, and I just, to me, it's not a different activity, because I come to the research with the eye of an architect, so I'm
especially also because you've been inquiring through drawing,
and searching for. I'm always interested in how, what was the process of creation? How did this thing come about? How did it get to that shape? So I'm looking at how it was designed, and then searching for then recreating the designs from texts or from ruined temples. You're putting together the pieces, and then designing a new temple. It's not a different kind of activity. It's not, I'm the genius, here's my design. It's trying to understand what was the tradition.
But you were also engaged in a way with Ajmer.
That's another one. That was.
I thought that was a current one.
That's finished. Well. That was looking at how do you reconcile the ritual and religious needs with current conservation needs in Ajmer. And then there's another one in South India, which is looking at contested heritage and the different viewpoints and of the temple authorities and conservation. Religious needs.
Which temple is this?
It's looking at Madurai and other big temples. This is with Drona and SBA Delhi collaborating. But the one I've been doing on this trip, which is another project which is coming to a close, but there's still a lot of stuff to explore and write. It's called the Nagara Tradition of Temple Architecture, Continuity, Transformation, Renewal, and it's looking at North Indian temples from cavemen up to now, or from sort of 5th century to now, including the contemporary practitioners, Sompuras, and looking at texts as well as the buildings. So Sanskritists working on texts, Aparajita Pracha, and various texts of different dates since then, and looking at how the texts change as well as the buildings, because texts aren't all, when people say the texts say, it isn't just, it's not the texts don't evolve, they do. Just as buildings do, the texts do as well. They incorporate bits of old text, but they also make new ones. They keep up to date with what architecture has done. So it's interesting to look at the different periods when the Nagara tradition revived, as well as in its
an iterative process with what is being built and what is being written.
Yeah, exactly.
Really, I hope
today
you will translate your skill to deal with both text and drawing to write. Now you're converting that into a new building, new temple, the Hoysala temple that you referred to. And I hope finally you will also convert that into a new text.
Into a new text, yes. as long as
where you can push the boundaries of the text as well.
Yes, well,
since they have a parallel evolution.
You mean not just another book on history of temples, but one that people
that
can
actually lays down.
That's a practical one for which people can use, as long as they don't think it's
but
a
it has to be
straitjacket.
Sufficiently conceptual to be
able
to be applied and to grow.
I shall have a go.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It was a wonderful discussion with you.
My pleasure.